All right, so today we'll continue on about creating a new Rails project, but now I'm going to do it inside of RubyMine. We showed you how yesterday using the Rails new command, Rails new and the name of the project, it created a directory for you with all of the files, and then it ran the bundle command at the very end to make sure everything was working right. And we worked through all the bugs and fixes and things to get that to work. Installing the dev kit, etc. So what I want to do is create a new project in RubyMine. And so I'm going to call it Demo 2. And I'm going to put it somewhere, my H drive here. I've got some bunch of stuff, RubyMine projects. I'll just put it here. And the type of the project lets me choose all kinds of things. We want a Rails application. All right, so we want to select Rails application, say OK. And it also lets us select the Ruby interpreter. I only have one on my computer, so this is fine. It lets me choose the Rails version. Remember when I showed you the gems that I had installed, it showed that I had a Rails version of 3.2.2, so I could go back and use a version prior if I wanted to, but I'm going to use the 3.2.8. The template, we skip over that, and the JavaScript library we leave as a default jQuery. All right, we say OK. Leave the checkboxes alone. All right, and one thing about IDEs, I notice that sometimes I watch you guys program in these, and you tend to get stuck in ruts about how to do things, like how to save a file and how to do different things. I highly recommend that you read these tips of the day and get to know your tool that you're using. There are hundreds of shortcuts and command keys and all kinds of stuff that help you become more productive as a developer. And in the real world, they expect you, the companies expect you to become very familiar with your tools and be able to navigate around these things very well. So spend some time just playing with the IDE, looking at the help, looking at all the commands, what they do, etc. All right. All right. So here is the what comes back when I create the demo. And again, we have, just like when we were doing Ruby, this is the folder, and inside is the entire Rails project with all of the directory structure and the files that we have to look at. And down here it showed what happened. It actually shows me the output of as if I ran this in the DOS prompt. So you see what it created. It created a README and a configuration file and a bunch of directories, etc., yada, 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 all the way down. Then it finally ran the bundle install command. This thing is annoying. The bundle install, and it says using, like we said. Oh, it didn't have the rack test, so it installed that one. Came down, and everything is happy. All right, so that's just, it did the bundle command for you, just like we did Rails new and the name of the application. All right, so in development mode, we're going to use SQLite. That's the default of new Rails applications. And it's a very simple database. The queries are a lot like MySQL. But it's a single-use, single-file database system. Yes? You can use MySQL if you want. Yes. Yeah. And typically when people deploy these, you can change the database and the code stays the same. Yeah. Yeah, basically you change this database.yaml file and you change some configuration, add some stuff into there, and so that's fairly easy to do. So we won't go into that too much. The database is a single file. And the database that it creates once we get into a database is going to be stored in the DB folder. There's nothing in here now, but DB stands for database, obviously, right? Most of the stuff we're going to be doing is in the app directory. This is the application, and this is where you see the controllers, the models, and the views, the MVC that we talked about yesterday. We have another folder called assets. This is where we're going to put things like images, style sheets, and JavaScript files. So if I open that, I see 3 different subfolders, and we're going to put our images in there.
Just the way you like it.
Just the way I like it. Isn't that great? JavaScript, style sheets. So 3 different folders. That's where we're going to start adding our stuff next week. The controllers are where we're going to have our Ruby files that are the controller, the brains of the outfit. The models are where we're going to have our files that deal with the database tables, the business logic, and the views have to do with what the page finally looks like. That's where we're going to put HTML and some special codes to display stuff on the page itself. So that's where we're going to spend most of our time. The config folder has some information that we will change, specifically the routes file. This talks about the URLs coming in and where they're supposed to go. And if we look in the environments folder inside the config folder, it'd be nice if I could get that bigger. You guys have it on your screen though, right? So the development, this lets me have 3 different environments built into this. So by default, I'm running in the development mode. Everything is in development. So Rails keeps a separate database just for development. So I don't have to worry about test data getting put into my production database. It's really nice. And then if I want to go into my test mode, it has a test database that it creates. And you can have test data to test your views and your models and things like that. And then when we go to production, it will create a production database. And that's where it's live and you don't mess with that one, right? That's your live database where people are, where your products are stored and things like that. So it makes it really nice. I don't have to have separate databases configured. It does it automatically for me. Very nice. The doc, these are, you can actually create docs from the code. We've never done that in our Ruby. But there's a program called RDoc, which will actually look through the source code and create documentation for you of all the modules and the classes and the functions that you have. And it's a real nice way for developers to write documentation because documentation is the thing that developers hate to do. They'd rather write code, leave it to somebody else to figure out what it does. So documentation is the last thing that happens. So they have that whole RDoc system built in, which came from the Ruby side, which is pretty nice. Lib is just a place to store. We can put our own methods and things to modify how Rails works. Log shows the development log, for instance, is basically, remember when I ran the server yesterday? At the very end, it showed my requests to the server. So this development log is a text file of all the requests from the server. So that can get very large. But it's a way of going back and looking and seeing if I had an error and things like that. The public folder is where in the pre-3.0 days, or 3.1 days actually, this is where you put your images and your style sheets and things like that. This is what the root of your web server is. This is where people can see any file that's in this folder they can see publicly. Okay, that's so right now, if I were to run the server, this index.html file is what comes up. This is the file. It's going to the public folder, looking for index.html, and you see it's got some inline style sheets. Why do you think they did embedded style sheets like this, not inline. They didn't want to have another file, so they kept it all in one file. And remember, this is all generated by Ruby code. So they have Ruby code that prints out to a text file this HTML. So they wanted it just all in one file. So if I were to run my program now, let's run the development up here. You can run in the different environments. I want to run in the development mode. So I run development. And down here, it's going to open up a new window eventually. I'm already there. It's not running. Oh, I didn't actually run it. What I that was stupid. I just selected which configuration to run. This is the run button right here. Click. There you go. Now this is the same thing that we did from the DOS window when I typed Rails server. Okay, so from a command prompt, I'm doing the same thing, and you see that I'm getting the same kind of thing. It's running WebRick. It's opening port 3000. So that's this listening port that's going on. Yes?
Okay, so in JetBrains, you selected the development environment and ran the server from there.
Right.
In command line, how do you decide whether you want it to run the server in development or
By default, it's development because most of the time that's what you want to do. To run it as in production, you have to set a command line variable to run it in production. But typically, that's done differently on an Apache server or something, so it's different than that. But by default, Rails server runs in development mode. Okay. So now, if I were to hit this with my browser, let me make this smaller. I go to what web address now? Localhost :3000 for the port, and you should see it come up here, and you should see a request line down here for that ping image, for instance. Eventually, we're waiting. Come on. All right, so I switched to Firefox here. This is what comes up, and this is actually reading that index.html page. And that index.html page has these links on it, this image, and you saw that it actually got this rails.ping image. All right? If I click on this link here, this is doing an AJAX call to fill in this div here with information about your Ruby environment. And it should show SQLite 3 here as your database, and then it shows you all the versions of Rails and Active Record and Action Mailer. Everything is all shows you the version, Ruby version that we're using, etc. All right? So, and that request came through as well as Rails info properties. All right, any questions on that so far? All right. So, the next step is we're going to create a controller, because the controller is the main piece that accepts the requests from the browser and does something with them inside of Rails. So we need to create a controller. And a controller, the way to do that from the command line, we're going to use the Rails command again, and then a command called generate. Now, Rails is big on these, what they call generators, to help create code for you. Because a lot of the code that you write for a web server is repetitious. The thing that I'm going to use for a blog on my site is the same thing you're going to use for a blog on your site. A lot of this stuff ends up being repetitious. So they wanted to take some of this mundane stuff out and create this code for you. So this So I say Rails generate, and the controller says what I want to generate. And then this is an action that I want to create here. So when this happens, and everybody's read the first 2 chapters of the book, right? You should have. You're supposed to have read it. You dream about it. Good. This is what the URL will look like. The say part, everything is a nice URL. You notice there's no .php question mark with command lines. It's a nice SEO-friendly URL. So the say part is the controller, and the hello part is going to be an action that we're going to talk about in a minute. All right? So I want to create a controller called say. So inside of my RubyMine, I can do that by running a generator under the tools command, run Rails generator. And I want to generate a controller. And notice how I just typed the first couple letters. It comes back and says, okay, that's what I want to have. If you look at the full list, there's a lot of things we can generate with this thing. But right now we're just going to do a controller. And what is the name of our controller? Well, I'm going to call it say. You might call it blog or articles or products or whatever. That becomes the main entry point to that portion of your website. We're going to have multiple controllers to control multiple pieces of our website. So we'll have a products controller, articles controller, blog controller, lots of controllers. Okay, question?
How did you get to that window again?
Under tools, run generator. Tools, run generator, controller, and give it a name, say. No, but it's a good idea to get in the habit of this. Capitalization is also important, as well as plurality and singularity is important when we name these things. So when we name our controllers, the controller must be singular. So if we're going to create a controller for our blogs, we call our controller blog singular, a single blog controller. And that's very important to have singular versions of these things. All right? The directory we can skip, and we'll skip the action. We'll skip the action here for now, and we'll just say go. So this is going to run a program, and you see the command line. This is what you would type in the command line: Rails generate controller say. And it will run the Rails command, generate the code for me, and it will actually generate a new file in my controller folder here. So this is what it created. It created a say controller.rb. It created a view, created some tests automatically because Rails is big into testing. We won't cover that in this quarter. We'll be doing testing in my Agile class. So normally we would write tests for everything, then we'd write the code. That's what you'll learn next quarter if you take my Agile class called test-driven development. And the tests, they're big into that so that if I make a change, I can test my code, make sure that everything still works, that you don't break something. Because you don't want to be deploying a change to your website and your entire website goes down, right? That would be a bad thing. That's where the president of the company calls you at 3 a.m. and you're in big trouble. I've had some of those calls, so just telling you. It creates some assets, some JavaScript files, and some CSS files, etc. And we'll work with those later. But inside of the app, inside the controller folder, now I have a new file called say controller. So based on the name of the controller, it created a file called say_controller. Inside of that, so this everything is based on naming conventions in Rails. So when I told it to create a say controller, it actually created a bunch of files for me based on the name of that controller that I had. So it created a class. This is just standard Ruby. Remember classes? I know that was a whole quarter ago. Classes, and it called it using camel case, just like we name our classes camel case. And it, what does this mean here? Inherits from a higher level class called the application controller. So just by doing this, we get a lot of free methods. Remember, like the 2S method that we created? We got a lot of free methods by inheriting from like the array class or something else. We get a lot of freebies based on this application controller. All right, it also created a view in the say folder. Actually, it didn't create a view. It created a folder for views here. And this code here, now let's see what happens if I actually go to that URL. Now the URL, like I said in my PowerPoint, is going to be localhost 3000/say, and let's see what happens. I should get an error. So I can type /say here, and I get a routing error. Okay, no route matches get of a say. All right, so I did this just to show you the routing, but I don't want to get into the routing too quickly here. So we're going to change the routing configuration a little bit. If you go to the config folder under routes.rb, this is a file, just another Ruby file, that has ways of changing what the URLs look like. All right, and we'll be adding our own routes to this later on. But for now, I want you to uncomment out the last line of this file. And this is, if you read the code above it, the comment, it says it's not recommended, but for teaching purposes, this makes it easier until we get into the routing system. All right, this is the way, it used to be the default and everything worked just out of the box, but they're trying to be more secure and force you to think about every route that comes into your system so that you don't have any holes. This makes anything match anything, basically. I mean, it's really, and we'll talk about the syntax of this later. All right, so now let's go back to my browser and see. I should get something a little better. All right, good. So at least it found the say controller and says unknown action. Now, by default, if there is no action, the action would be the separate part of this, the second part of my URL. Say is the controller, the action is something else. So if I do something like hello, I should get a different error saying an unknown action, hello, could not be found. So it recognized that hello was the action from this URL, and say is the controller. So it found where all of this was in my code. I just don't have any code to respond to that yet. Okay? Any questions on that so far? This will make a little more sense when we actually have some code here. All right. So let's make an action. And then, remember, what do we put inside of classes? Accessor, okay. What else? Definitions, methods, exactly right. Methods, then any method inside of here becomes an action. So if I say define a method called hello, and don't put anything in it, I now all of a sudden have an action. And inside of that action, I can do stuff. But for now, let's just do that and look at and reload my browser here. Okay, so it said, okay, got a new error, and I'm going through these errors to make you understand these errors. Okay. It says template is missing. It doesn't know now how to create what your hello action is. There's no view associated with that. Remember that in my code, where was my picture from the book here? Here it is. So this is the controller, comes in, it comes to the say controller code, that class. It looks for a method called hello because that's an action. And by default, there's nothing to do in that. So it passes off control to the view. And since there's no view defined for my hello action, it crashes. So I need to have this loop at least created. So I need to create a view, and that's what it's telling me here. I can't find a template, say hello, and it's searched in my app/views. All right, so everything is going to be in my views folder here. All right, so inside of my view folder, I'm going to create a file, create a new ERB file.html is what I want to create. All right. And this is going to be the name of the action, not the name of the controller. The name of the action is what? Hello. So I'm going to call it hello, and I hope it puts the right close. That's not right. We want to call it hello.html. .erb. Okay, the ERB will be put on automatically for you by RubyMine. So I'm going to rename it. And let's just put something in here like, hello, Dave. At this point, this is just HTML. This is where we're going to put our HTML. So let's see what happens now if I go and reload my page. Hello, Dave. Sweet. So let's see how the flow goes again. The flow came from the browser. I requested the say/hello URL. Rails said, okay, that converts into the controller called say. So it routes me to the say controller. It looks for a method called hello. Nothing in the hello code is there to do. So it just skips that and goes on to the view, which is in the view page here. So everything is based off the naming convention of say. So it looks for the view called hello under the folder called say. Everything has to be in the right place, has to be named correctly. Now, the one nice thing about RubyMine is that as soon as I have this in place, I can click on this little icon next to my view, and I can go back and forth between the controller and the view because these are tied very closely together. So if I click here, it's going to take me to the view for my hello action. If I click here, it takes me back to the action, the controller for my hello action. All right. Does that make sense so far? Yes.
So if you put like adding that H1 tag.
Yes. Very good. So let's do that. You anticipated me. So this is all just HTML. All right. I can do that. And notice my server is still running. I haven't had to restart my server. And in fact, because RubyMine knows this whole development process, I make a change, I go look at it in the browser. I make a change, I go look at it in the browser. I'm going to do that 47,000 times a day. So it knows that as soon as I click out of this application, it saves all of my files for me. And because I'm in development mode, Rails looks at any files that have changed and reloads them. So I don't have to start and restop the server every time I make a change. So everything is all happy. I don't have to rerun it. If I'm in ASP, I think you have to rerun it every time you make a change. I don't know. Is that true? You guys haven't had ASP yet. You haven't? Okay.
You compile a DLL and upload it to the server. You have to do an IIS reset.
Yeah. So
If it's just an HTML or a JS or a CSS,
you don't have to.
just upload the file and it will change.
Okay.
It's a runtime violation.
So I go back over here and I reload it, and everything's all happy again. I can add some more text. This, I can't do that, Dave. And I reload it, and I've got HTML. I can put any HTML tags I want in here. Notice how I'm not putting any head tags or the beginning doc type or anything like that. These views are partial pieces of HTML that are going to be displayed inside of a larger framework. All right, and we'll talk about that more on Monday. Yeah.
So, you can put anything there, but how about I will put a video?
Well, a video, what you do is you're putting a link to a video resource. Just like this is just HTML. If I put an image tag, let's do this. I can say I want an image, and the let's see, source equals assets / rails.ping. I'm putting a link to, this is just text. It finds the server because I have a rails.ping in my assets, which we'll talk about later. There's an image inside of here. It goes and finds it and loads it into the page. So if I had a video there, I would put a link to the video, and the video would show up here. Yes. All right? Very good.
So for video, does it automatically, like, most videos are usually embedded in Flash layers? Does it automatically build the JavaScript to the embedded
No.
Flash layer?
No.
You have to write that.
You have to write that. It's not that smart.
How does that head stuff work, though? Like, say you're going to have multiple style sheets like that?
Possibly.
One for, like, tablets?
Yeah, and that's why, and I wasn't wanting to talk about that yet, but that's why when I created my controller, it created a say.css file using Sass, which we'll talk about later. It created this, and there's nothing in it. But I can have a different style sheet for each controller, for instance.
And if
I don't have to.
It defaults to the master
Right.
application.
Right, this application.css. And in fact, all of the, see, you're getting ahead of me here, all of the head and HTML is in this file called application. Inside the views folder, inside this file called layouts, this is what is displayed on my web page. So if I look at my web page actually and look at the source, this is what I see that matches. So you see this doc type, which is an HTML5 doc type, and the yield, right, is the code that's inside the view. This here, remember the yields that we did in Ruby, that is the code that is inserted from that view page.
Like an include.
Like a what?
Like an include from like PHP where you can do include.
Yes, right, exactly like that. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is HTML. So if I want to mobile application, is same thing?
Yes.
Just change the style sheet size.
Right. Right. Exactly right. All right. Isn't that cool? That's pretty sweet stuff. And I went the long way around to do this. If you guys remember our programming challenge, I whipped out a whole products controller with one line of code. And we'll get to that. But you have to learn where each piece lays and what it does before we get to that. We have to take some baby steps. And this might seem a little tedious, but because most websites are the same, if I follow, remember they were all about convention over configuration. That's what Rails is. By convention, most websites, a blog looks kind of like this. So if I follow the convention, I can do a single line of code and generate a lot of my site very quickly. And that's why developers like this. It makes them more productive. They can charge the same amount of money, but they can whip out a website in no time at all. All right? So we'll get to that, but you have to be patient and understand that if I want to change something, I need to know where it is in the Rails application to change that. All right? We'll do a lot more of this. But you can play around with that. If I wanted to, one last thing, let's do a real quick new method. If I create a new method, what am I creating? What's the term? A new action, all right? So I could say goodbye, and I don't have anything in here yet. We'll add some stuff next week. Now, I need to have a new view for my goodbye action. Each action has a corresponding view with it. So RubyMine, since it knows that this is an action, I can just click on this, and it says, I can't find it. Do you want to create it for me? Nice. So it creates it, puts it in the right folder, on the Save View folder, goodbye.html, and it's blank, and I say, goodbye, Dave. All right, so now I can just say goodbye, and it says, it pulls up the view for the goodbye action in the Say controller. All right, so it's very easy to add pages like that, and I can add HTML. On Monday, we'll start looking at ERB, which is embedded Ruby. So if you want to think about that over the weekend, it's in your book. That's where we're actually going to add variables into the page itself. And that's where you start to get the dynamic portion of how Rails works. All right, any questions?